everything. Image is everything. Now, I'm not going to be making any judgments here this morning. I just want to share some observations with you. There's a certain segment of the motorcycling population for which image is everything. Their motorcycles must be the correct make, Harley Davidson. Their helmets, if they wear one, must be like a black skull cap. Their leather jackets must be emblazoned with the outstretched wings on the back. Their boots must be heavy black leather, and their tattoos must be numerous. For them, image is everything. And anyone else is just a wannabe. I know a fellow, and I've known him for a number of years, who wears a Stetson hat, Western-style shirts with snaps that look like they're made out of mother of pearl, blue jeans and a leather belt with a belt buckle as big as a jar lid, and pointed cowboy boots to complete his attire. But the closest he's ever been to a cow is a steak on his bladed out back steak. To him, image is everything. To Lady Gaga and Justin Bieber, image is everything. I remember not too many years ago when many young girls tried to adopt Britney Spears' image, heaven forbid. And a bunch of little girls and young girls at St. John's Church who were Britney Spears wannabes. To many of today's top political candidates, image is everything. They'll try just about anything to project a proper image to their base. They, like most movie stars, hire professional image makers to help with projecting just that right image for election or re-election. But you know what? Before I start pointing fingers and you start pointing fingers, I would suggest to you that most, if not all of us, try to project a certain image for someone. And we could argue that the ancient Israelites were as image-obsessed as we are. After they arrived in the Promised Land, they began looking around. And they noticed all these Canaanites, celebrity kings. And they wondered why their own judges, like the old prophet Samuel, looked so scruffy by comparison. And so they lobbied for a king to govern them. A handsome celebrity action hero to go out and fight their battles for them. And despite Samuel's warnings, they wanted the image of a king who would make them like other nations, they said. Other nations. It wasn't like God had been down on the whole idea of a king. In Deuteronomy 17, God laid out the prototype for an Israelite king as one who shouldn't buy into the ancient bling of horses and wives and money, but instead who would keep 2 copies of the Torah with him to read as a constant reminder to obey God and not exalt himself over the members of the community, over his subjects. Such a king, you see, wouldn't be a celebrity. That king would be a servant. But by the time of Samuel, however, Israel had, I guess, conveniently forgotten that God had called them not to be like other nations. And that God was the real power behind the throne. They were determined to have the image of a legitimate nation. And so they told Samuel they were willing to pay the price in material and blood that a royal celebrity would exact. And so God, as he's often wont to do in Scripture, punished the Israelites by giving them exactly what they wanted. The prototypical image of a tall, dark, and handsome matinee idol monarch. King Saul, though, was like so many celebrities, whose shiny outward appearance hides a dark and broken interior life. Saul's reign quickly started to look like a bad reality TV Israelites, however, are just tickled to death with Saul. They're just so pleased to have with the image of their king, the image that he was projecting, and they knew that they could get Saul to play to the crowd. And they badgered Saul into keeping the spoils of war that God had strictly commanded them to destroy. You see, God had already determined that Saul was fully lacking in substance, and he was sorry that he had allowed the bling king to be crowned. And so God commanded Samuel to anoint a new king. So we get to our scripture reading now this morning that Carl shared with us. Samuel travels to an out-of-the-way village called Bethlehem for what can only be described as a runway fashion show of potential kings. First down the runway is the oldest son of Jesse, Eliab, and he certainly looks the part. He's tall and he's handsome, just like Saul. And Samuel's ready to pull the cork out of the oil bottle, buddy, and just splash him with it. He knows this is the new king. He's going to anoint him. But God's seen enough of this reality show. And in one of the most poignant lines of Scripture, God lays out the criteria for those who will take a starring role on the stage of Israel's history. God says this: do not look on his appearance or on his height, on his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. Thank goodness. They look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. You know, folks, what matters most to God is not the image that we create, but his own image in us. God cuts through all the appearance and all the masks that we love to wear for each other. And he looks deep into the real self that's hidden under all those layers of makeup and material things and make-believe roles that we play. God knows us like no one else knows us. That can be frightening sometimes, can't it? It can be frightening, but God knows us like no one else does. And in the case of the new king, God was looking for a man after his own heart, not the oldest, wisest, strongest, or most handsome of men, but someone after his own heart. And David was that man. Even though he was only the youngest boy, so young that he wasn't even considered by his father as worthy to stand on with the rest of the sons on the runway. Oh yeah, I got one more son, little David. He's out keeping the sheep. And just get him here. Get him here. We're not going to sit down till he gets here. Samuel anoints the young boy David in the presence of his brothers. Not just his brothers, but his older brothers. It had to be a real shock to them. Sure, he was dark and handsome, the Scripture says, with beautiful eyes, but he was still just a kid. Hardly a person yet in those days, just a good-looking little old shepherd boy out in the field. And yet David will have a relationship with God by which all other kings in the Old Testament can measure. The image of God, you see, folks, is everything. We're created in God's image, Scripture tells us, and we're created in God's image for a purpose. David is chosen for a specific purpose of leading his people with no pretense and no resume. And each of us is chosen for a purpose that has nothing to do with fame, fortune, or face time on TV. Our purpose is to reflect the image of God in us and no other image. And to live as people who authentically love and are loved. God defines our true identity as his created and loved image and calls us to live out that identity in community for the whole world. Indeed, Scripture tells us over and over again that God does his best work through those whom the rest of the world wouldn't give 15 seconds of attention, let alone 15 minutes of fame. People like the poetic little shepherd boy, a bunch of middle-class fishermen, and Apostle Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. Appearances can be deceiving. God looks at the heart. The only image that matters is God's image in us. Few, if any of us, will ever be famous to the rest of the world. Few of us will. Not many of us will be like our favorite son, Brad. Few of us will have that opportunity. But we are all famous to God. Each and every one of us is famous to God. It's God's picture of us that is most clearly focused and long-lasting. May you and I be the people who skip the bling and instead strive to be the picture that He's created us to be. I'm so glad that God doesn't look at me the way the rest of the world does. I'm feeling as to be an old man now. I'm bald-headed. I'm overweight. The knees hurt sometimes. I wear glasses. But God still looks at me, and God still loves me. And God says that I'm precious in His sight. God looks at each of you that way as well. God doesn't care whether you wear glasses or whether your ears stick out further than they should, or whether your nose is crooked or a little longer than it might be, or your eyes are crossed. God doesn't care about any of that. God cares about what's in your heart. What's right here is most important to God. Thanks be to God through His Son, Jesus Christ. But I'm beloved